be an ethical argument. Okay, and then, and it's got to be logically plausible. I think that speaks for itself. And then the next part, we get on to ethical theory and research. And here I'm going to channel my inner Pat Croskery, who I always miss more when we're doing this exact particular event every year. He was fond of saying, this is the ethics bowl, not the theory bowl, right? So theory, for a lot of judges, ethical theory is sort of a tricky thing. Not tricky in the sense that judges have a hard time understanding it, but tricky in the sense of not knowing exactly what to make of it. There are some judges that sort of emphatically don't like cases that just appeal to ethical theory, right? They'd prefer to hear ethical principles or something of that kind. There are other judges that like it quite a bit. So what we tell the students is, you're welcome to use ethical theory, right? But you're not required to, right? So you don't automatically shoot to the top of the score range because you cited Kant or Aristotle or Rawls or Mill or some such. If you are using ethical theory, or if a team is using ethical theory, it's their job to make it clear, how they're using it, what the theory says, why it's relevant in that particular case. So in short, it's not enough to just sort of drop names, right? Like, we think, Hobbes gets this right, and then move on. So I always tell, my students when I'm coaching, they give an explanation of the theory that you would give to somebody, who is an educated friend, but maybe not somebody with the same background you have. So if you were to say, a Rawlsian viewpoint, and they say, I don't know what that is, what would you say to them to get them to understand it? That's the sort of level of explanation that I want to see as a judge. I want to know that the students understand it and know why it's relevant. So they can bring an ethical theory or not, but there must be a good ethical argument there, right? And it can't just be name dropping. Similar things go for research, right? Some teams do quite a bit of outside research, others don't. And they're welcome to use it. They're not required to use it. If they are bringing in outside research, it should be made clear why that research is relevant. I want teams to cite their sources. People have this wonderful ability to pull statistics out of their hat. And I'm not looking, they don't have notes with it. So, I don't want, in the New York Times on April 15th, 1974, page 9, it said this, but, they should at least say a recent article in the Times said blah, right? Don't need to cite the authors, but I want to know where it's coming from, not just statistics show, and I want to know why it's relevant. What John's highlighted here is good, right? We don't want to just bump them up for doing research in the same way we don't want to just bump somebody up for saying Kant or Aristotle. But does the research they did, the research they brought into the conversation, deepen their position, right? Does it help, for everyone in the room with the understanding of the salient ethical features of the case? Okay, and then finally, the last couple of them, right? They're not trying to guess what you think as a judge and hold disagreements against them. Now, if you disagree with what they're saying because you think that their argument didn't have an ethical component, or it was unclear, going back to the first section, or just logically, conclusions don't follow from premises and so forth, then that's fine, right? But they don't need to land on your opinion to get a good score, right? The thought behind these cases, this is, I think, the part of the beauty of Ethics Bowl, and I think what our case writers do very well is they produce these balanced cases that one could sort of reasonably, this will lead to John's next part, but reasonably find themselves on either side of an issue, right? So it's not a let's get it right thing. It's how compelling is the argument? Is it a good ethical argument? Is it logically consistent and so forth?
I I stopped sharing just because I want to allow perfect, Paulette. I was just going to say I want to allow some chance for hands and questions. And I'm going to emphasize something in a second, but go ahead first.
Thank you. Could you explain a little bit more? So the teams are supposed to use ethical reasoning, but they don't need to use ethical theory. And to me, those things are intertwined. And so could you say, maybe give an example of somebody
Sure.
using ethical reasoning, but not what you're calling theory? Thank you.
And I'll say a few words, and then Richard, if you want to weigh in as well. The way that I think about it is, I might say, I'm going to think about the principle of beneficence here. Okay. I may not talk about how I'm sort of where I'm getting that principle from, right? So I might use ethical principles without sort of giving the theoretical basis for those principles. I might talk about autonomy, but not talk about Kant, something like that. Right? That's the way that I tend to think about it.
Yeah, I don't have much to add to that other than maybe just to make it clear the way I was using theory was Kant's theory, Mill's theory, Aristotle's theory, as opposed to something like, the example I was going to give was autonomy. So,
yeah. The one thing I wanted to emphasize that Richard mentioned at the end is this issue about disagreeing. I think it's really hard sort of psychologically to know when we think someone's did a bad job because we disagree with them and when we think they did a bad job because they did a bad job. The way that I try to think about this is thinking about whether my disagreement with them stems from a disagreement about our basic foundational assumption. So if a team comes at something and they sort of defend a view using a view of, rights where rights are inviolable, right? And and it's very coherent and they've got a well thought out view. But I happen to come at it from a different perspective, a more utilitarian or consequentialist perspective, where I think rights are not inviolable. That to me is like not a flaw in their presentation. That's a difference in our starting points. Now, we'll get to this when we talk about judges' questions. That is a perfect opportunity for inroads for judge questions, right? Well, you tackled this from this perspective. What would you say to somebody who came at it from this perspective? That's where you get into the nuances of judges' questions. So I hope that's helpful in terms of trying to keep clear about the difference about disagreement. Any other questions before we go on?
Before the questions happen, there was something in the chat that was sent privately to me. It's a good suggestion. We also probably want to highlight the difference, between ethical reasoning and legal reasoning, right? So, similar, if someone's, giving a very legal argument, well, the Supreme Court has ruled this, and that, and so forth. That doesn't necessarily entail that that's going to be the morally correct thing. So again, channeling the inner Pat, it's the ethics bowl, not the legal bowl. It's the ethics bowl, not the moral theory bowl. So that was from Val. Thanks, Val.
Great. All right, I'm going to reshare here. We're going to go back to the scoring criteria, and we're going to try to pick up the pace a little bit here as we go. So that I think there's going to be more questions as we get into the judge Q&A session, things like that. So, all right, so the next section here is the consideration of alternative viewpoints. As you know, right, this is one of the features of the ethics bowl, is that a team is not just staking a position and defending it to the death, but that they can show that they are aware of what good reasons on the other side might be. Alternative viewpoints, by the way, is phrased that way intentionally. It is not just about those who would answer the question the exact opposite way, right? They might say, well, we're getting to our answer this particular way. Someone else might get to the same answer, but a different way. That would still be part of this. But the emphasis is on reasons that might support an alternative view. Okay, so you want to be particularly watching for that. The only things that I want to highlight here really is one of the things that I think separates really great teams from pretty good teams. I think pretty good teams, when they get to this part, they sort of say, here are a bunch of objections. Done. And like, really, to consider objections is to articulate what they are, what the value of them is, why your view seems to override them, right? Not just list some things that the other side might say. So that, to me, is something to watch out for as a judge. And the final note is, again, something we're trying to tell you not to necessarily focus on, which is teams will do this differently. I think a lot of teams from an organizational point of view will say, we'll now consider some objections. But as you know, if you've done any reading of arguments of any kind, sometimes when you read an argument, people start with the objection. They might say, you know, before we get to our argument, there's several good arguments someone might make on the other side. There are various ways to do this. And so it's something you want to be keyed into as a judge. Quickly, we're going to leave the initial presentation. So I'm going to stop sharing again real quick, just see if there's any quick questions. And then we're going to go through the other parts of the match. Again, trying to leave some room for when we get to the judge Q&A. Any questions? Okay. Richard, I wanted to actually go back 1 second to the theory.
Sure.
One thing that I know Richard and I have talked about in the past in training sessions too, Richard mentioned this first part. Their job is to explain it to somebody who is a knowledgeable person who doesn't have expertise in ethical theory. But many of you do have expertise in ethical theory. So if a team opens a door to an ethical theory and kind of gets it wrong, that's fair game for you to follow up on and think about, both in your judging of whether you think their ethical analysis is good and is something you can push them on in a judge's question. You should always adjust for, I have a PhD and they do not. But, you know, if someone fundamentally botches something when they, that's something to be conscious of.
Well,
Okay.
I was going to make the same point, John. If chapter 2 of your dissertation at great length and pains shows exactly why the standard interpretation of Mill is wrong, don't hold that against them, right? So,
right.
There's kind of a reasonable person standard. What might be fair to expect somebody thinks about of you, because we can get in the weeds very quickly.
Yeah. Okay, so we're going to handle these next two parts sort of as a unit. And Richard, if you want to go ahead, we're going to just talk about the commentary and the response to commentary.
Yeah, okay, so this is often referred to as the rebuttal by teams. And I think that's the maybe biggest mistake a judge can make, right? The place where you could sort of get things the most wrong is to be looking for a rebuttal. It truly is a commentary. The teams have been preparing their positions for 8 or 10 weeks, and they may have come to the exact same conclusion, right? So they're not automatically, when responding to their team, just going into attack mode. They often do, they often don't. What we're looking for is a good conversation, something that shows that they've heard the other team's points and have things to say about them. A critical discussion could be very positive, right? So, and you'll see a lot of this. So don't save your highest points for the ones that tear the other team apart or refute them. Just look for the sort of best conversation that can be had, right? Were they carefully listening, and do they have very thoughtful things to say? The other thing I would say here is often teams, they have 5 minutes here. We'll just go into the 5-minute version. This doesn't happen as much as it used to, but it still happens. They'll go into the 5-minute version of the case that they would have presented, had this come up for that team. And that, that can be okay. For me, I never give higher than a 7 if they're not actually grappling with, the other team's position in some way, or, engaging it. But if they want to launch into just a short, well, here's what we think about this, then, they're not really commenting on the other team other than just very indirectly. So, the better scores are going to be the ones that really, take issue with what the other team said in a positive or negative way. But thoughtful discussion.
So I'll talk about the response to commentary. One thing I do want to highlight that appears in both the commentary and response to commentary, it actually appears in every facet of the match, is this note. There had been a debate among Ethics Bowl folks for a few years about whether we should somehow penalize teams who were just kind of jerky and, just came across as very antagonistic and people had suggested things like having a point penalty, et cetera. And we haven't done that. But what we did do is build into the actual scoring rubric this idea that teams should offer a commentary in the spirit of a collegial conversation intended to deepen the ethical analysis of the case. Same in response to commentary, same in response to judges. It's very vague, right? But this is a way for you to say, okay, you did a good job sort of taking them to task, but man, was that not in the spirit of a collegial conversation. Now, you have to decide how much to consider that, but it is listed among the things that a judge can weigh. So it's just something for you to be aware of. Teams are pretty good at this, but because at the national level, the competitiveness gets up and up, it's something that we try to just remind both teams and judges about. And as you remember, this is a scoring guide for teams just as much as it is for judges. So it's more like a reminder for the teams to be mindful of their the quality of their conversation.
John, we have a good question in the chat from Brightman. It says on commentary scene, sometimes teams will in their commentary pose questions to the other team. Is this fair or not? And I've said yes, but you might want to elaborate on question showers and that
Perfect.
sort of.
And this goes perfectly into both the commentary, which I'm highlighting right here, this point, and then down here, the response to commentary. So one thing to be aware of as a judge is more is not always better in terms of a commentary team. What I mean by that is a commentary team might say, we noticed the following 13 things and we want you to talk about them. Well, I tend to the view that teams have a responsibility to sort of decide for themselves which are the most important things that they want the initial presenting team to address, right? And so they should sort of show that they can appreciate these are important, these are less important things for you to come back to. It's the same with questions. So if a commentary team poses some questions, they can do that. But if they say, here's 15 questions we'd like you to respond to, it's very important that you as a judge understand that the team that's responding to that commentary does not have to address all of those questions. They can pick, hey, you asked us 8 questions. Here's the 3 we think are really important. What your job as a judge is to do is to decide, did the commentary team focus on what you would think are the most important issues? Did the team responding to that commentary respond to what you thought were some of the most important parts of the commentary? One of the things that sounds, I guess, arrogant, but I always think a good way to think about it is if a commentary team steals your judge's question, that's good, right? It means that they have picked up on something that you thought was really important. And so if you see that, right, that's a good way to help you think through sort of a filter about this. Any questions? This is a good place to pause again. Any questions about the commentary, response to commentary before we get into the judge Q&A? Tyler?
So in instances where the commenting team gets something really wrong in their question, for that, right? So I remember a regional where the commenting team was bringing up the First Amendment in a way that mistook the meaning of the First Amendment. We can penalize the commenting team for that if they're asking questions that are mistaken, right?
Absolutely. I don't know. I had a little trouble hearing Tyler, so I don't know if anyone else had trouble, but I think the question was, if a team in their commentary sort of misunderstands something, should they be punished or penalized for that? The answer is yes, right? So what makes the commentary and response to commentary a little bit tricky as a judge is you're kind of doing two things at once. You're using the criteria specific to that part of the match. Did they listen carefully to the team? Did they respond thoughtfully to the team? Did they avoid deliberately distorting the team's position? But you're also keeping in mind the things from the presentation. Was it clear and organized? Was their analysis, in fact, sort of well done and thought out, right? So this is to your point, Tyler. If just like in the presentation, if a commentary team just sort of is, either has an incoherent commentary or does some things that are inaccurate, you should absolutely hold them accountable for that.
Can I just highlight?
Go ahead, Richard.
Oh, no, finish your thought, John.
I was just going to say there's a second point to be made here, which is that you're really scoring each part of the match separately. And that becomes relevant, especially when we get to the judge Q&A, right? That like, if a team does a not great job in the initial presentation, but their view becomes clear to you as a result of the judge Q&A, unless you realize that you misunderstood something, you shouldn't be going back to change your score, right? But teams could sort of, be very good in an initial presentation, but just really not know how to respond to a commentary well, or et cetera. We adjusted the scoring a few years back so that the judge Q&A sort of counts for a larger percentage of points for this reason, because we think teams can do some of their deepest thinking there. But
okay, yeah. So let me just elaborate on your answer a little bit. So Tyler, your question's a good one because it's something that comes up a lot. I think it's not that often that teams make mistakes about facts from the world, what the First Amendment means, but it does happen. But where you will see mistakes quite frequently, they may get moral theory or moral principles wrong. They'll have read one little bit of utilitarianism and they'll say, well, Mill hated liberty, and you're thinking, well, no, there's a whole book, right? So if they're going to sort of be brash and assert or attribute views to philosophers, or elaborate on principles, and they do it wrong, they should be penalized, and that happens a lot. The area where it happens even more, in my opinion, is, and John mentioned this, that it might be deliberate and might not, but they will get the other team's argument wrong, right? So suddenly you've got this commentary that's based on a straw man version of what was the other team's position, and that shouldn't count as a very good commentary, right? And if you think they just misunderstood, decide in your own mind if you think that's worse than something that seems like an intentional misunderstanding. But either way, you don't want to give high marks to a really nice criticism of an argument that the other team didn't get. So definitely be on the watch for that.
thanks, Richard. That answer was way better than mine. So
No way.
Go. I had one other thing I was going to say, but now I can't think of it. So unless there's other question about this, we'll go into the judge Q&A session. Okay. I'm going to share again, and this is the part that I think we'll have the most conversation about. And you'll notice here, I'm going to turn this back over to Richard here in a second, but we just want to show you that in this new guide, that we sort of divided this up into expectations of judges and expectations of teams, again, because it's sort of to be used partly as a coaching document. We're going to focus really here, but some of these expectations for the teams is about things that you might be wondering about, like their responsibility to keep answers to your questions short, things like that. So we might talk a little bit about that as well. But Richard, if you want to start us on the expectations of judges, go ahead.
Sure. And if I could just note something about expectations of teams, I don't remember what we were doing with teams wanting to confer. So when you get to that, find out what Mark's telling the moderators. In our regional, I think we went with they could confer once for each judge's question for up to 30 seconds, but I don't know if it caps at one at nationals or that's just what we ended up doing. Yeah, okay, so these expectations sort of lay out the procedure, and so you can look through that, but the long and short of it is judges can go to a breakout room and confer for a minute. As you do that, you really shouldn't be talking about impressions of the case, right? Your vote is your vote. And we don't want other judges to influence you. Maybe you saw something the judge didn't, vice versa. So in that minute to confer, it really should just be, I'm going to ask this question to make sure that we're not being redundant. What did you want to ask? Figuring out who's going to go first. And if you don't want to take the minute to confer, some teams of judges just sort of decline that and let it happen organically. Often with more experienced judges, they'll get to this part of the round and they'll have 7 questions in mind, and they'll think, well, I don't need to clear mine. I'll go last, and I'll just ask what wasn't asked from my list. Okay, so you get back, you have 10 minutes. You're allowed to ask 1 question and 1 follow-up. And the follow-up really should be a true follow-up, right? Don't take that as an opportunity to ask a whole different question. You've got about, a little over 3 minutes each, 3 1/3 minutes. So you want to be mindful of how much time it's taking you to ask your question, right? There are judges that we've had at nationals that'll start telling a story. And, suddenly they're 3 minutes in and the question emerges, right? And that's unfair to the other judges, which isn't really that important, except for being unfair to the other judges ends up being unfair to the teams, right? Because the judge might have a pressing question about an earlier part of the case. They're going to give the team the chance to explain themselves and help themselves out. But the 10 minutes expires when we're in the middle of the second judge. So, try to think of questions that you can ask concisely. Teams have a tendency, and this is on them, to give lots of answers to questions. So the first judge will ask a question, somebody will say something, it'll take, a minute and a half, and someone will say, I just like to reiterate that, and they'll say the same thing. And someone else will make a different point related to it. And, you could wipe out 5 or 6 minutes on the first judge's question. So, if that happens, it's unfortunate. But the only thing you can really do as a judge to help with that is at least keep the amount of time that you spend asking questions to a minimum. Come in, very succinctly, ask the question, get out. Okay, so it says here, no requirement that a judge ask a question. Let's see.
Yeah, Richard, I want to highlight this too. So.
Okay. So yeah, do you want to talk about that?
Sure.
I'll just say the one little bit, which is, if you don't ask a question of team 1 and then you give the win on your card to team 2, the students are very upset, and so are the coaches. They think, wow, you didn't even have a question for us, and somehow they connect that up with, you thought we lost. You should have had the question in place that saves them. If you really don't have a question, then you don't, but you may, try to have one, I guess is my suggestion, or give that team the win, right? Then they just think you didn't have any questions because they were so brilliant that, there was nothing to say. Go ahead, John.
Yeah, I was really going to say what Richard said. I'm going to disagree a tiny bit with something Richard said in this sense. I don't want to phrase it in terms of which team you give the win to, but I think if you score that team poorly, right? Because just the way the points might have come out, it might be that you didn't ask a question and the other team, you just thought on the whole leaked them out the way it laid out. But I think the thing that drives me crazy, it drives coaches and participants crazy, is if teams sort of shake their head and just say, like, I don't know, like it's almost like they're disgusted. Like, I'm disgusted by your presentation, so I'm not going to ask a question. I think that's an abdication of your responsibility as a judge. And I'm sorry to put it in such blunt terms, but that it's not just the teams that have a responsibility to have the conversation be done in the spirit of a collegial conversation intended to deepen an ethical understanding. So if you don't think a team did well, it is your responsibility as a judge to help them do better by pushing them or asking them a question. And I think this leads into the other big point about judging is just how do you think about what sorts of questions to ask? I was originally going to make this point with this is the one I was forgetting, with the commentary and response to commentary. One thing you'll see at the Nationals, and I'm going to bring this back to judging in a second, but you may see an initial presentation that's amazing. And one of the hardest things for a commentary team to do is to know how to give a commentary on a really awesome presentation. And it's a similar problem that you might have as a judge. If a team has done an incredible job, where are you going to go, right? I want to give the same advice for sort of both parts, the commentary and the judge Q&A. My view is that if a team does not a great job, you give them an easier question to see if they can't clarify something or get at something. If they do an incredible job, this is your opportunity to say, okay, let's change the example a little bit. What would you think about this, right? That's where it becomes okay to sort of almost move beyond the parameters of the cases it's let out. It's a good thing. It's a sign that they're already kind of getting an A. And that might be a way for a commentary team also to do a good commentary on a great presentation. They might say, you did a great job. We don't have a lot that we think was missing. We're just curious. What would you do about this? What would you do about that? So when it comes to judging, one way I think Richard and I both think about this is your questions almost are a function of how good you think the discussion has been so far, right? And you have to keep that in mind when you score them for their responses to your question, because if you're sort of asking them a question because you think they've already been amazing, so your question is like a triple backflip level, and they don't quite land the triple backflip, to mix some metaphors, you can't destroy them in the score for that because you were only asking in the first place because they were already doing an amazing job. I hope this makes sense, right? That like you're sort of adjusting how tough you're being and the toughness of your question based on what you've heard so far.
Yeah, John, let me say that there's a number of things going on in the chat, and I'll just encourage people to take a look at that. It's not anything coming up that we need to address, but people are talking about judges pontificating and offering some suggestions for questions you can always ask. So good kind of useful stuff going on there. Let me quickly share a story. So I took a team to a competition many years ago, and the team was in the final round. They did very well, and the judge asked the question, "What grounds moral theory?" Which put fear into the hearts of everybody in the room. The team struggled with it and said, "Oh gosh, in the end, we don't know." It was way too sophisticated for him. And afterwards, the judge laughed and said, "Your presentation was so great. I just wanted to see what you did with that." And everybody loved it. It was a happy occasion. So this sort of following up on John's point. I mean, if you think they're great, just press them on something. You base this whole thing on Mill. Why didn't you go with Bentham? That kind of thing. Don't do that to nail the team. But if you're really liking what you're seeing and you don't have any questions, let them have fun with it. My kids really appreciated it. They liked the struggle. At the time, they thought we're dead because we don't know how to answer that. And I can tell you, 40 years into my career, a lot of it ethics-based, I still don't know how to answer that question. It was really tough. But you can, feel free to go outside the box and really press them if you think that, if you don't have anything that you're kind of wondering about the case.
I just want to touch on something that I saw in the chat. It's a really good point. Someone mentioned, sometimes I won't have a question because someone else took it. We want to emphasize this. It is fine not to have a question. It's just this issue of like you refusing to ask it because you think the team did poorly. That's the issue. It's also fine to yield a question. And this leads to like you might say, I don't have a question. I know Richard had an additional question. Richard, why don't you go ahead? It is fine to do that. The rules say that there's time for a question and a follow-up per judge, and then additional questions if time allows. So it's fine to do that.
Yeah.
For those of you who are newer judges, this is an opportunity to emphasize something. You have about 4 layers of help during the event. So please don't be nervous, okay? There is no room that will be filled with all new judges. It's part of our job is to make sure we've got a variety of experience in every room. So if you, and this is, somebody said, I don't think we really need the minute to confer as judges. And that might be based on individual experience. My experience has been that it is useful precisely because sometimes newer judges won't have a sense of what to ask, and more experienced judges could say, well, I was thinking about this. What about if you ask that? Sort of help each other, right, in there. That's your first layer. If there's any confusions about the format or what you're doing on a score sheet, you've got the moderator. If there's a problem that extends beyond that, a group of us are going to be in a room all day, all weekend. You've got that. And the moderators will also have my cell phone number by the time the event starts. So please know that there's layers of support there. So if at any time you're a little nervous about anything, you will be able to turn to someone else in your match who can help you. Let me just see if we're caught up here on the chat as a recent student. Yes, thank you, Mary. It's a great addition and a great point. Like that's really the goal of the Ethics Bowl is, right, to have teams feel like when they're done, wow, that was an awesome conversation. So any questions that people want to ask out loud? We haven't talked about format, mainly because most of you are experienced and also because the moderators will walk you through this. Anyone who's been a participant or a judge, none of that's changed. We have extended the conferral periods by 1 minute when teams confer. They're on an honor system. They shouldn't have pre-written notes. They shouldn't be communicating with anybody who's not seated for the match, etc. So moderators will have to pay attention to that. But again, it's an honor system more than anything else. So those are just basic format things, but again, shouldn't be an issue. And all the technical issues, the moderator will handle that stuff. The moderator will put the judges into their rooms, etc. And if you have any questions about how to actually get into the matches, that's where you'll be in contact with me. Denny?
Yeah, I want to go back to the notes question. I assume that students may be taking notes during the presentation as a way to, they hear a teammate say something, oh, he missed something, and, so that they can move further with it. But so how do we distinguish between that and what I call the brain dump? When they walk in the room and then start writing everything they possibly know about their cases so that they've got it ready?
So it's a great question. So the moderators know this and will be reminded of it, and the moderators will remind the teams that they should not come with any notes prior to sitting down and shouldn't write any notes to themselves or anyone else prior to the reading of the question. At that point, they can do that. Now, we have literally up until 10 minutes before we opened this meeting, we were still talking about whether to allow them to have the Zoom private chat function enabled. They will have that enabled as a way of communicate. Now, there's a limitation to that because you can only communicate to one other member of your team that way. Teams will also be allowed to communicate with each other through other methods as long as it's on the same device they're using for the competition. So the honest truth is there is no way we could actually prevent teams from gaming the system, right? They could have tons of notes. They could be doing research as they talk, etc. It's the Ethics Bowl. Andy mentioned this idea. We should actually expect them to behave ethically. Yes, right. That's what we have to do, right? So they can absolutely pass notes to each other at any point, and the expectation is that they're doing that in a way consistent with the rules and the spirit of the Ethics Bowl.
Yeah, and in fact, if they were going to do the brain dump thing, knowing that they're not supposed to, they'd be better off to just write all their notes out really big on construction paper and pin them to the wall behind their computer. I mean, this is a competition where it would be very easy to cheat. So we're having to trust that it's not happening.
Right. But so just in terms of team communication, I'm trying to think of how we can allow them to do something like what they would be doing in the room if we were all face to face. So they can have a group chat, group text chat going, and so that they can talk privately among themselves, right? Without
They
judges or
could have
anybody.
a Google document. They could
Yeah,
have
yeah.
a
Okay.
Discord channel. They could do, I don't know what Discord is, but I think you can use that.
Right. And it's the same as passing notes. And then, they'll be put in breakout rooms during times when they could confer and then they could speak out loud. So in that sense, it'd be identical.
But isn't going in and out of breakout rooms I'm worried about the technical aspects of that and whether that is going to create more problems.
No.
Well, let's clarify. They're only going into breakout rooms at the normal conferral periods and/or during the judge Q&A session. So they're not going to be like in the middle of their presentation and be able to go into a breakout room or anything.
I can tell you, this is my 5th bowl this year, all using this exact same format. Our regional, the 2 high school bowls I went to, the other regional, and the 2-year bowl all use this format, and it went smoothly. It's not like being there because it adds quite a bit of time, right? The 75-minute round is now the 95 or 100-minute round. But we didn't have any problems in any of those bowls with the technology related to breakout rooms. The one problem that comes up sometimes is screen will freeze, and it used to be if someone left the match, they couldn't come back, but frozen screen means you have to log out, log back in, and that was an issue. But John and Mark, in putting together the moderator instructions, have come up with some great ways to deal with that as well. So
Okay.
there are points where they ask the judges if they didn't hear some part because somebody was cutting out, and off the clock they get a moment to repeat just that part. So it ended up working quite smoothly.
Thanks, Richard.
Yeah,
Yeah.
just long. It's gonna be a long day.
Lauren, you have your hand up.
Yeah, so is it fair to assume that all of the competitors will have already done a virtual e-bowl, or are some doing in person?
All the regionals this year were held virtually. So they've all been through it. They might not have all used Zoom. They will have an opportunity to go and check out the room that we're going to go to at the end here before the event too. But our finding has been, there's no way to say it's nice. It's usually the judges that have the problem with the technology, not the students. So we're very hopeful that, everyone feels very comfortable. A lot of you have probably judged or moderated in regionals this year. And every single moderator is an experienced moderator this year. We have no, there may be one exception to that, but we were very, very, leaned very heavily on making sure that we were being very careful about putting people in positions we knew they would be comfortable in. Yeah, Justin, and then David.
Actually, I was just wanted to bring to everyone's attention. Bippin had a great question in the chat. I was wondering if you could address it, John. It's basically about allowing judges to confer on scoring to see how the other judges score. I think we have moved away from that, but could you touch on that?
Yeah, not only have we moved away from it, we never were near it. You should not, and Richard mentioned this, you should not be collaborating on scores at any point with other judges. And this goes back to the point about just be consistent. It's okay if you score lower than the other judges in the room or higher, but you don't want to get in the habit of and this is why In some regionals, I noticed that they put judges into breakout rooms while the teams were in breakout rooms. We're not doing that. So the judges will remain with the moderator while the teams go to the breakout room. There's a reason for that, because the temptation is if every few minutes you're just talking, you're going to wind up talking about how you think the teams are doing. And we want to really limit that to, you get 1 minute, it's about which questions you're going to ask, period. And the moderator can keep an eye on you because you'll be left in the regular room for all the other periods. Yeah, thank you, Justin and Bipin. David?
I'll just add quickly, not only, don't share scores, don't even share impressions, right? Don't say that wasn't bad, right? And it's okay to be the outlier, right? Even if you're the outlier every round, you all bring different perspectives to the table. That's great.
By the way, this is a change that we made. This is now about 3 or 4 years ago, but over the years, there's been moves in this direction in a way, back and forth. The winner of a match is determined by majority of judges. Okay, not by total points. So you could have a team in the past. Sometimes what we'd have is we'd have 2 judges score one team the winner, 1 judge score the other team by a wide margin, and the 1 judge winner won the match, right? Now it is possible that the two judges, they're the ones that are wrong, but we thought it would be better to err on that side than the other, so we made that change. So those of you who maybe it's been a few years since you've judged, you might not know that, but this is yet another reason not to worry about being the outlier, is that it's by majority of judges. Yeah, David?
Hi, I just was wondering if you had any requirement that that the kids be in separate locations, or are you just leaving that up to the schools, or because presumably they could all be in masks in a room together conferring?
This is a great question. This is one we deliberately worded vaguely in the rules. There is a rule that says that they must be in different locations. It does not say different rooms. The idea here is it's a social distancing rule. They should not be on the same device sitting next to each other. If they're in a big, let's say you have access to your campus and your team is in a classroom scattered around, 100% fine. That's consistent with the rule. But we were basically saying, we are not going as API and as the IEB, we are not going, we want to send the right message to teams about social distancing. And we didn't want to say it was up to your state or up to your school. We wanted to have a view about this. And so that's the way we resolved it. Andy, you had your hand up, but then you put it down.
Yeah, that's because I forgot what my question was.
Sorry. Okay, well, if anyone has other questions throughout the week, let us know.
David has his hand up.
Who? I'm sorry?
David Antonini.
Is that a new one, David, or is that a leftover hand?
Well, I think it might have been, but I actually do have just one other, just small. I didn't know if at my region, there was some confusion at the end of the judging rounds where the judges were actually not doing the normal thing like they would do in person, where they would hold up the sheet.
Oh, good. Thank
you. Like the round would end and the teams were kind of left like, who won? What were our scores? So I was hoping that could be resolved at the national level.
I'm glad that you mentioned this before we leave. So teams will know who won before they leave the room in this event. But this will be different than what you've done in in-person events. So, and I would have forgotten. So thank you, David, for this. So what Richard has done is he's developed a spreadsheet for every moderator that's broken down specific to their room and broken down by round. So the way it will work is you will use your judge score sheet, which is on the API website, will also be in the competition website. That's a fillable sheet. Actually, you could digitally fill it out. In theory, really, it doesn't matter if you use that sheet or you're keeping track on scratch paper, but it's just a good idea to use that sheet so that it minimizes any risk of error, right?
John, before you go on, let me contradict you.
Oh.
If you use scratch paper, it should look an awful lot like the score sheet,
right?
Because we are going to collect them. So, something that you can take a photo of and mail in, or, the score sheet's a PDF. So if you're just kind of scribbling notes and reporting them to the moderators, then we don't have this after the fact verification.
And in the email we send to you next week, we'll give you very clear instructions about how you eventually submit your score sheets. But that will sort of be done after the fact. The official score sheet will be the moderator score sheet. So how this is going to work is match ends, moderator takes the judges into a breakout room. So it's the 3 judges and the moderator in the breakout room. The moderator will walk each judge through their scores and will say, okay, what is your score? 3 subcategories for initial presentation. What's your subtotal? What's team 2's score for commentary, et cetera. They'll walk you all the way through it. They will verify that with you. You'll be able to watch them put those scores on their moderator score sheet that they'll be sharing with you in the breakout room. That's where we're doing all the live verification that the scores are correct. That moderator sheet is a Google sheet, so it'll be automatically sort of synced up to a master sheet. This will allow us to be very quick with all of our calculations throughout the day. Again, my thanks to Richard, who yay. So that's how the scoring will work in the competition. You'll come back out. It's really up to the moderator to decide whether the moderator is then going to have each judge announce their scores or just the moderator do it. Since you will have already given the moderator your scores, the suggestion to moderators will be the moderator will announce the scores. Judge 1 had this, Judge 2 had this, Judge 3 on this. Team blank has 2 judges out of 3, team blank wins, right? The point differential is X. And so they will basically orally communicate to the coaches all the relevant information, right? Who won and the point differential so that teams can sort of keep track about tiebreakers in their head.
And,
I hope that helps.
And on the spreadsheet, there's a page that the moderators share. So they'll do a screen share and it'll pop up and show all that as they're stating it, right? So teams can do a screen capture, take a picture, whatever they want. They'll have their scores from the judges, point differential, all that. John, there's a good question in the chat on this. So Jonathan says, when I judged Upper Midwest, the moderator broke anonymity of judges when scores were announced. Is there a safeguard from this? So historically, we haven't had anonymity, right? We're just in the room and the judges are holding up their scores. But the way you described it, John, is Judge 1 gave this, Judge 2 gave that. So I don't know what Mark's telling people. Are we preserving anonymity?
You know, it's a good question. I don't know, to be honest, that we've really thought about this, because normally if Andy's reading his score, everyone knows what score Andy gave. So I don't think we're not all that worried about it. I think, you know, you might have a moderator that says Judge 1, Andy Howard. You might have a moderator that just says Judge 1. So yeah, I don't think we're going to be trying to really instruct the moderators to preserve anonymity of the judges. This is also a related point. A lot of people ask, will there be time for feedback to teams? Maybe. We have allotted an hour and 45 minutes per match, which should be more than we need, and 15 minutes to go from one place to the next. That's just going to be sort of feel of the room, moderator, et cetera. So we might see some variety that way. You never want to get into a argument, right, with the team or whatever. But if time allows, there may be some time for you to say, hey, great job, everyone. You know, some very short advice. Tyler?
Just to clarify, and I put this in the chat too, judges are sending in PDF copies of score sheets, or we are not sending in. In the Upper Midwest, we sent those to somebody. Are we doing that this time too?
Yes, but you won't be doing it necessarily like you'll sort of send them in when you're done with your judging duties. You'll be sending them likely to me. So it's not the same as immediately turning them over to the moderator at the end of a round. And I was typing this, but then got distracted. We'll send you very specific instructions about exactly what we want you to do with your judges' sheets by email this next week.
Tyler, I should say that I just answered that question in the chat, but I see that I only send it directly to one person. So sorry you didn't get an answer right away.
David. Okay, it will be shared with the screen. Yeah, so the moderator will indicate everything to both teams, sort of both out loud and they'll be able to see the actual scores. Yeah, there may be room. We have a summer workshop every summer that we invite all of you to attend. Some people have different feelings, obviously, about the anonymity issue. This is how we make the bowl better, by just talking through these things. So, I think for this competition, we're not going to change it, that we're not going to have any presumption of anonymity, but we appreciate that some other regions do it differently, and we'll bear it in mind. So, okay, I am going to type something in the chat to all of you, and we want to get you out of here. We hope ethics will, oh yes, won't talk. Yeah, yes. Okay, so what I'm putting in the chat right now is a link to the room we're going to go and check out. And this is the website that is designed for the competition. You don't need to come right now. It's just an opportunity if you'd like to come on over. Just give Richard and I 2 minutes to get over there before you all come over. And you're going to see it's going to look basically exactly like this, but just want you to sort of understand that, like, this is the website. What you're going to get on Monday is you're going to get a username and password. Everyone will have the same username and password. We're not super worried about Zoom bombing, but let's not, don't put your Zoom username and password into on Facebook. Say, hey, I'm judging. There will be an opportunity for observers to be there, just an FYI for you. We don't expect this to result in any room being crowded, but you might have a couple of observers in any given match, and they will be, so that everyone knows this, the way the moderators are being instructed is they're going to have every member of the team change their name. So it's school name, competitor name, right? And then judges, this is actually important for you. Your name will be judge, and then your name, or some abbreviated version of it. Okay. So then anyone who doesn't have an assignment as moderator, judge, or participant is an observer. So just so you sort of know what the room is going to look like. One other quick sort of technical note, I find that switching to speaker view helps me focus on the person who's speaking in the virtual environment. It can be hard to track, a conversation when you're seeing 12 faces. But if you switch to speaker view during the presentations, you should be able to feel like it's a pretty natural way of listening to people. Okay. Donna, this is sort of the quote unquote dress rehearsal. We just want you to see this room. We can play around with it if we want a little bit. So it's optional. You don't all have to come, but it would be probably a good idea to check it out. And if there's any issues with technical things, we can help. You're going to be asked when you get there for your name and email. All right. We're going to, so go ahead and copy and paste that link. Richard, are you still a host?
I'm not, so I reclaim my privilege.
Okay. Well, one second, let me stop recording.